Today's keynote panel includes 4 individuals who are global thought leaders and national treasures in their own countries. This morning, we are very honored to welcome Dr. Gunhild Stordalen, the founding member and the chair of the board of the Stordalen Foundation, Melinda Gates, the co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Sweden State Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Annika Söder, and Dr. Hans Rosling, Professor of International Health at Karolinska Institute and co-founder of Gapminder. Please join me in welcoming them here today.
I'm really thrilled. It takes a lot to have me not to make a presentation. But today I'm fully satisfied with that because this is my dream panel. Could we ask you to come up? Could we ask you to come up? And thank you very much for coming. What I thought when I knew that Melinda was coming was, couldn't we have a discussion between government and philanthropy? Because philanthropy touches upon all different aspects of society. But I've noted, especially listening to you, Melinda, and to Bill, and how you think government is very important. And it's
definitely.
Yeah, and it's how to work together. And people think that I'm kind when I want to look at this positive, how to really be complimentary, but I'm not kind, and I'm not even polite.
Sometimes you are.
No, it's by default. No. But I really, intellectually, when you see it, there are a lot of complementary ways, because the government can do things that philanthropy cannot do, and vice versa. And all the three of you, you are so professionally involved in what you're doing. It's not just about giving money, it's about deciding how that money should go. And then we have decided, Annika, that you should start. Because to me, you represent the civil servant in how Sweden deals with the world. And not only that you have worked in...
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, in your career, because we have met each other over the years in so many different positions. And not the least I admire when you took on as vice director for FAO, the agricultural organization, which was a tough job. UN administration, to be civil servants in the United Nations, that's tough. And we had a lot of good discussions there. And then you had a short stint at the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation also. So you have looked at how a civil society organization works. And now you are this beautiful, beautiful title, kabinettssekreterare. You can't, when you don't speak Swedish, you can't understand how beautiful it is. Secretary of the cabinet, it's one of the old titles that we keep in Sweden. So please, our cabinet secretary, can you tell us, how do you think the complementary forces should work when you deal with extreme poverty and climate change in the world?
Thank you very much. And already at the outset, I think we should define the topic for today, that this is about international philanthropy, because we also have a contract in our country between philanthropy, civil society, business, government, that has worked for a very, very long time. And we're not going to talk about that today, but it's also my starting point that the one sort of requires the other in order to make the country or the world move forward. I also think it's important to make a distinction between philanthropy as a shy person wanting to give money to something very important but not do advocacy, while here we have two very prominent representatives of providing both resources and advocacy on extremely important topics. And this government's view on philanthropists is also related to the fact that you always need to be pushed and pulled to do the right things by outside thinkers, be they philanthropists, business, civil society, and academia. So I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to talk about how we can work well together, because, as I said, the one requires the other. Let me first, and this is not very polite of somebody representing a feminist government and a feminist foreign policy, but I'd like to quote Bill Gates, who said on the Swedish radio last year that he thinks it's extremely important that governments engage in development cooperation to deal with global challenges, global public goods, and to deal with poverty in countries where poverty is a problem. And we were very proud when we heard this, because there was a recognition of the long-term endeavors that are maybe not that obvious all the time that governments do, and the knowledge that governments long-term build up on issues of concern to citizens in our country and around the world. Let me also say that I looked at the figures, and the Swedish Development Cooperation budget is about as big as the development budget of the Gates Foundation annually. So here we see two people providing as much as 10 million people in Sweden. So we really respect what you are doing. Let me also say as a starting point that the way the world looks today, it's a very double picture. We are achieving a lot on poverty and on rights issues around the globe, I would say mainly today in Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, while we have growing uncertainty and unrest in our own neighborhood, around the Mediterranean and to the east, with the situation that I think we're all struggling with more aggressivity from Russia. And this is the context where we work, and where I think that many have realized that equality and getting rid of inequalities is the basis for stable societies where people can play a role, where we can have innovation, where we can move forward. And this is, of course, the role of the government to see to it that we provide the environment in developing countries also through development cooperation. So when we talk about the possible conflict between philanthropy and governments, I think there are basically not a conflict, but there are some differences that are very, very important between the way we work. For a long time, development cooperation has been about building systems and supporting countries. While I think the image we have of philanthropy is more short-term interventions and looking at what may appear as the most topical issue that would give my company headlines, or that for me as an individual donor giving money to Red Cross or Amnesty some satisfaction. The challenge for the government is, of course, to give that satisfaction to the taxpayer so that he or she understands that the contribution he or she makes is useful in this very context, without this taxpayer knowing exactly where the money goes. Now, having said this, I had the privilege of being a board member of Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, where the Gates Foundation played a very important role as a founding entity. And already then, about 10 years ago, I understand that philanthropy, like the Gates philanthropy, is actually looking as much as we do at the long-term results, how health in a country can actually be sustainable in the long run also without our intervention. So there is much more meeting of minds between philanthropy and government that maybe the man or the woman on the street would actually believe. The other role that I think is extremely important, and where we have two fantastic representatives here, is, as I hinted at in the beginning, the advocacy role. For some reason, I think that both Melinda and Gunhild have more credibility advocating for resources to a certain intervention than governments have. And maybe we should ask the audience why is that? We all want to be credible. But the role you play in making governments, business, countries that may not think about health interventions, for example, as an important factor, that role, I don't see really how we can live without it. Then there is another very important difference, and that is my final remark: accountability. Governments are held accountable. We have to go to elections every now and then. And the flip side is, of course, that we're really scrutinized. We have to show all our documents. It will be known what we do. The downside is, of course, that there is a risk that we plan very short term, as you would if you have a company where your shareholders would also ask you for short results, while philanthropy can very often work long term to see to it that the interventions are sustainable and predictable. It's also important when you contribute, for example, to the United Nations, that does not lead, in my view, that to a situation where the influence by the 193 countries that actually own the United Nations is reduced because of one or two major contributors that would then sort of undermine the democracy. So you have a democracy factor here that I find very interesting.
Thank you. Gunhild, you run Stordalen Foundation, and when I read on that web page what you want to do, I like the word nudge. And you even have another foundation called Green Nudge. And I nudge, nudge. Yeah? So is that how you see yourself, moving things forwards? And how do you see, what is it you want to move forwards? Is it the public, the companies? Is it the government? Who are you nudging?
When it comes to nudging, that's really a new tool in the policy toolbox for the transition to a sustainable future. Nudging is behavioral economics, and it's all about designing society so the easy choice becomes the most sustainable and healthy choice. So it's something that can be applied by governments, and it's easily accepted by us, the consumers. But I would like to start in the opposite direction, if you allow me, Hans, because I think when we are talking about philanthropy and the role of governments, my favorite quote is probably Jean-Claude Juncker, which puts it perfectly well. He says that we all know what to do, but we just don't know how to get re-elected once we have done it. And that's it's a very good point, because, and you were mentioning it as well, Annika, and the short-term election terms, 4 years, and then you're out of position if you are not promoting the policies that we as consumers and voters are focusing on. And unfortunately, and there you can take in the behavioral economics and behavioral psychology, because we are short-term thinkers, and that's illustrating the need to apply other type of knowledge and other tools in the policy toolbox. But I just came now from hosting conference called EAT in Stockholm a couple of days ago, and there's the main objective with my point of philanthropy entry point is collaboration, because I think the main bottlenecks for moving on towards a more healthy and sustainable future is really not, it's not lack of knowledge, it's not lack of finances, political will, but the main obstacles is really lack of collaboration, cooperation, and co-creation. So what EAT aims to do is really to gather the different stakeholders that is involved in food, health, and sustainability around the table. Not only the different academic disciplines, but also the policymakers, civil society leaders, and of course governments. And by gathering all these people and increased understanding, exchange of knowledge, there is some optimism that we can really achieve measurable results. So one of the good quotes from the conference was that if you want to move fast, move alone. If you want to move far, go together. And that's also a very important observation and how we should push things forward.
And that's an African proverb, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and I really admire what you have done with EAT, because you have even merged different academies of science together, you know, and that's difficult, you know. And it must be that you have had a very long-term idea when you did that, because of putting them together, you didn't get an outcome just within 1 to 2 years.
No, and but just let me say two things about that, because the challenge so far is that, and I'm coming from the health society, being a physician, and but my passion has been on climate or on environmental issues. In particular, I've been working a lot with philanthropy and climate change. But it's so difficult to get people enthusiastic about changing behavior or changing policies for climate change, for polar ice bears and melting polar ice caps. So when you start linking climate change as a health issue, which it is, then people start to listen. And Melinda, you can tell a lot about the consequences of climate change, in particular in low and middle income countries, which unfortunately have least to do with it. But when you are talking about the co-benefits by linking climate and health, then people start to listen, then governments start to listen, because there's about turning challenges into opportunities. So EAT is really a way to focus on the area where climate and health agendas really converge, and that's the plate. Because in order to feed 9 billion people, or more than 9 billion, by mid-century, we need to identify diets and food production systems that are both healthy and sustainable and climate smart. And so far, these issues haven't been linked. So there's a huge knowledge gap in order to identify from the academic side, and then we need also to work with governments and civil society and business, in particular the food industry, to really put things forward in the right direction.
Thank you. And I heard there 2050. That's quite a period. That's 35 years. Now, Melinda, over to you. You are not up for elections. Is that the big difference? You know, she's worried for the next election. She gets these numbers coming every month, you know. And it's tough when you're in government. They go down the numbers, you know.
It should not be exaggerated.
But I also see that you and Bill think long term. How do you think generally in your foundation?
Yeah, so maybe I'll just give a little overview about who our foundation is and how we came about doing the work that we do. So Bill and I were engaged in 1993, got married in early 1994, and we took our first trip to Africa together in the fall of 1993. We went to see the animals in the savannah. We loved it. But honestly, we came back so touched by the people, and so much asking ourselves why. You know, why is it that we can be in a nice Jeep driving down a road, the roads weren't very good, but why can we leave these countries in Africa, like Democratic Republic of Congo, and go back home and have running water, but they don't have that here. That just doesn't make sense to us. And so it was actually on that vacation before we got married that we made the decision. At the end, we had a nice beach walk out in Zanzibar, and we made the decision that the vast resources that had come from Microsoft, the vast majority would go back to society. It was a very easy decision for us. We both came from families that believed in giving back and in volunteerism. And so then we set upon what I call a learning journey. And I would hope that my entire life and Bill's entire life, we're on a learning journey. And we started to say, what can you do? What can philanthropy actually do if you want to change the world? And who are we? What do we believe in as a couple? And what we arrived at was that we really believe that all lives have equal value, no matter where they're lived. If it's Bangladesh, or it's Senegal, or it's Boston, or it's here in Stockholm, all those lives are equal, but the world doesn't treat them that way. And so we started to say, okay, if we're going to make investments, how would we do that? We care that every dollar that we put down actually has a profound effect. And we started to realize that we believe as a couple very much in innovation. I'm also from the tech sector. I'm a computer scientist background. And we believed in the power of innovation to be able to change things for the world. And so the first place that we invested, as Annika said, was this Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations. We came together with a whole host of governments to create a vaccine alliance, because a vaccine saves a child's life. And you don't have to spend very many kroners to have a child get a vaccine. And literally, when you look in the history of the earth, what has brought down child mortality? Why do you have so much less in Stockholm? Because of vaccines, and yet we take it for granted. But we looked long term. We said, okay, our foundation's resources, we made the decision that they would all be given away essentially within our lifetime. That is, the last of whoever Bill or I passes away. Within 20 years of the last of us passing, all the resources will be given away. But yet, if we cared about things like childhood death around the world, or people lifting themselves out of poverty, being able to eat and then put crops on the market and get an income, we needed to deal with those problems in our lifetime. That we were hoping that we know other philanthropists will come along. We can't predict what's going to happen 100 years from now with the problems of the world. And so we set about saying, well, if we would care about poverty and we care about inequity, there is no way our foundation, which looks large to the world, it is tiny. It is a tiny drop in the bucket of the need. And so we said to ourselves, all philanthropy can do is be this catalytic wedge to take some risks out of the equation, to show what works, but then it's up to government to scale that up. And it's not just governments in Europe or Japan, but it's also working with the African governments, because they know what works in their cultural context. And how do we merge those points of view, and how do we pull more people in to say we want to have a large amount of money? So in vaccines, we just raised another $7.5 billion as a world to go against putting vaccines for children. And because of that fund, as one example, we could go to the pharmaceutical companies and say, we can guarantee you an African market now. If you give us a slightly above rate of your cost of your vaccines, we'll guarantee you this very large market. And so we stimulated them to start creating vaccines for markets they hadn't gone after before. So both to get down the lag time between when a vaccine comes out in Europe to Africa, but also specific vaccines for Africa. So that's just one area we've worked in, but it kind of highlights how we think of philanthropy in concert with the government. And I would say the last thing I'll just say about this is, I think when we went into this work, we were naive on lots of fronts. But one of the ones we were most naive about is how much we would eventually use our voice with advocacy. Because advocacy, getting citizens to realize how important these world goals are around poverty or reduction of child death, advocating to governments, African governments, to put in more of their own money for health, governments in Europe or the US to put in more money into things like vaccines or in agriculture. Bill and I spend a lot of time on the road now doing advocacy, because the voice of a philanthropist, we can highlight what the Swedish government has done in a way that you can't. We can say, look, these kroners, this is why these children are alive, your investments in this Alliance for Vaccine or the Global Fund. And we can call on governments to make investments, and even an African government to make a policy change that will have a profound effect for their citizens.
Thank you very much. This is really an argument I've met. I meet a lot of the general public, and people in decision positions. And then they say, oh, this development aid, they just waste my money. Ha, is that so? I say, how come then that Bill and Melinda use their own money for the same things? Do they? They said. And that's really, as you said, the credibility factor. So are you envious that you are not running a big philanthropy and just is a cabinet secretary?
I've tried the UN and I've tried to be a civil society person, so I think maybe that's the next step afterwards. We will talk about that afterwards. No, I'm not jealous, but because, as I said initially, the voices that come from engaged entities, people, are incredibly credible, and we need them in order to be able to move forward. And as we support each other's in the work, it's fine. But of course, the long-term perspective, we try to keep it, but it may be harder than for a philanthropist.
I've also noted that it comes with governments all over the world. One thing that touched me was when my colleague, who were Minister of Health in Africa in a country, said that he got so happy when he was at a conference in Seattle. You and your husband invited the ministers of health from Africa to your own home, and you offered them dinner, and they served us. And then they listened to us the whole evening. And this is also something that you listen to the governments where you want to implement what you are doing. At the same time as you bring your business knowledge to talk with the big pharma so they can make business. So that must be very hard work you are doing. You are really involved in it as if it was your business you were doing. When you do the philanthropy, it's hard work.
Yes, and we enjoy it immensely. And I think that's the thing. We didn't want to just be a couple who sat in Seattle and wrote checks. I mean, we do write checks, but we knew that this work required a real understanding of very complicated things. And we thought we had some talents to bring to bear it, but we have to learn. And that's what I said, we're on a learning journey. And so, we want to talk to African health ministers. They understand in their country what needs to be built out. So I'll give you an example. One of the goals Bill and I have is to reduce childhood mortality. It happens to be one of the highest goals, as most of you probably know, from the Millennium Development Goals set by the UN. We travel a lot. I'm in the developing world at least 4 times a year now in various places. Okay, so childhood deaths have been cut in half now since 1990, so cut in half. But when you go on the ground to see how has that happened, in Rwanda, they have had the steepest decline in childhood mortality in the history of the earth in the last 5 years. Well, Agnes, who is the health minister in Rwanda, made a specific decision about how she wanted philanthropy to come in, government money to come in, and how she was going to build out her health system. So at the lowest level of that health system, which is a little health post about the size of this stage, a woman can go in and get her childhood vaccines for her child. She can go in and learn about antenatal care. She can go in and get a contraceptive for herself so she can space the births of her children. It's those investments. But if Agnes, we can't go in and say, this is how to do it. We can bring models and examples that we've seen work around the world. Agnes is learning about those herself. She's now speaking to all the other African leaders. But it has to be done, the investments have to be done in a way that works for their country and meets the goals that they have for their own citizens. And that is the way I think that you're seeing governments now and private philanthropy, and then we're bringing all the best of academia to say, okay, how do we move things forward in a way that works for a particular country?
You also put the emphasis on contraceptives. You did a big launch there together with the Prime Minister of Britain and African leaders. And that was after listening not only to leaders in Africa, but also to health staff in the periphery and to women. And I think you are much, much more than technology oriented. At least you're part of the married couple. And I remember listening to that. How did you come to take on that step? You have a Catholic background also, so it's like especially bold to do that.
Yeah. So as I'd be on the ground, when I'm out traveling in the developing world, I'll be in Malawi this summer, I'll be in Tanzania, I'll be in probably one other country yet to be figured out. But when I'm out, besides doing the advocacy meetings, the government meetings, I go out and sit with men and women, but women in the villages. And I also go into the slums a lot. And as I would be out talking to the women about vaccines in their children, something I cared about, if I stayed long enough, they would talk about contraceptives. And they would say to me, it is a crisis. I can't have another child. I have 5. I can't possibly feed another one. And how come I could go to that little health post before, and they could see it, and I can still get vaccines, but I can't get contraceptives. And as I heard this sort of cry around the world from these women, I came back to read the global statistics. And if you looked high level, it said contraceptives were stocked in because of all the AIDS money that is out there. But what was stocked in was condoms. And women will tell you over and over they can't negotiate a condom in their own marriage because it suggests they have AIDS or their husband does. And so I started to really look deeply at the data and started to realize we needed to do something and give the contraceptive tools so that women could voluntarily decide, do they want to have more children, and have the availability of the tools that they want to use. Things like you all use here in Sweden and that I use at home in the United States. And that's what we did.
That's feminist foreign policy, isn't it?
Absolutely, and this is the way also our agency, SIDA, works. But it's also about laying the foundation for the norms, because what Melinda talks about is basically women's rights. It could be about contraceptives, it could be about land, it could speaking about agriculture.
Absolutely.
Knowing that 70% of the small farmers in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, are actually women. And there, I think also government-to-government contacts play a role. We can sit there in the villages and discuss with our staff on the ground, but we can also discuss bilaterally with an African government, if we talk about Africa, about the norms and why it's important to have inheritance rights, land rights, sexual rights, and so on. And we can discuss that in international fora in order to push all of them to move in the direction that most women around the globe think is the right direction.
And Sweden was one of the leaders on sexual and reproductive health for a long time, and you always have been out in front. So even your feminist foreign policy, I haven't heard any of the governments that have that yet, but I bet we'll have others in about 10 years.